A dog lay trapped beneath a frozen creek, its life slipping away in the icy water, but it wasn't fighting for itself. Something else kept it alive, something the rescuers could never have expected. The winter morning clamped down on the small town with brutal cold. Snow blanketed the ground, crunching under the boots of the rescue team as they hurried to answer a desperate call. A hiker had spotted the dog, its body locked beneath the ice of a creek a mile from town. 3 volunteers, their faces wrapped against the biting wind, loaded ropes, a small axe, and thick blankets into their truck, their hands stiff from the frost. The creek cut through a silent valley, its surface a cracked sheet of ice glinting in the faint dawn light. Bare trees stood like sentinels, their branches sagging under heavy snow that drifted down in clumps. Beneath the ice, the dog's form was faint, its black and brown fur plastered against its thin frame. Its paws scraped weakly at the frozen surface, each movement slower than the last. The volunteers dropped to their knees in the snow, their breath clouding the air. One swung the axe, ice shards scattering with each strike. Another clutched a blanket, fingers fumbling in the cold. The third ready to harness, the wind's hull drowning out their rapid breaths. The dog's eyes, dark and unyielding, stared past the rescuers. Its body shook violently, but its gaze remained fixed on a point beyond the ice. The team hacked faster, the axe's blows echoing in the valley. Water welled up as the ice broke, soaking the dog's matted fur. With a final pull, they freed the animal, its skeletal body limp and heavy with water. They wrapped it in the blanket, expecting it to collapse from exhaustion. But the dog's head lifted, its eyes still locked on the distance. A faint crunch of snow broke the silence. A young deer stepped from the trees, its legs trembling, its coat dull and ribs stark against its sides. Its eyes were hollow, its body weak from hunger. The dog's focus never faltered, even as its breath came in shallow gasps. The volunteers froze, their hands still on the dog. This was no accident. The dog had risked everything, not for itself, but for the deer standing alone in the frozen valley. The rescue team carried the dog, its body bundled in the heavy blanket, through the snow to their truck parked at the valley's edge. The wind whipped across the open ground, stinging their faces and rustling the bare trees. The deer followed, its steps uneven, hooves sinking into the deep snow. Its eyes never left the dog, its thin frame swaying with each gust. The volunteers noticed the deer's persistence, its legs trembling from weakness. One reached for a bag of grain, but the dog's condition demanded their focus. They placed the dog on a padded mat inside the truck's heated cabin, its fur dripping icy water onto the floor. They rubbed its limbs gently, coaxing warmth back into its chilled body. The dog's breathing was faint, its chest rising and falling unevenly. Its fur, matted and thin, revealed a frame hollowed by hunger. The volunteers noted the sharp outline of its ribs, the way its legs quivered when touched. Yet, even in its weakened state, the dog's head turned toward the window, searching the snow-covered landscape. Its eyes, dark and intense, sought the deer standing just beyond the truck. The volunteers watched, their hands pausing. The dog's strength was fading, but its focus remained unbroken, tied to the creature outside. The drive back to the rescue center was slow, the roads slick with ice and snow. The truck's heater hummed, warming the cabin, but the dog's shivers persisted. Its body was frail, its energy spent, yet it lifted its head each time the truck slowed, as if sensing the deer's presence. The volunteers' faces tightened with concern. This was not just a starving animal pulled from the ice. It carried a purpose, a bond that defied its own suffering. The deer trailed behind, its steps faltering but relentless, its breath forming faint clouds in the freezing air. At the rescue center, a low building with frost-covered windows, the team carried the dog inside. They placed it under a heat lamp in a small treatment room, its walls lined with medical supplies. The dog's body warmed slowly, its fur drying under the lamp's glow. Its scrapes were minor, but its hunger was severe. The volunteers offered small sips of water, careful not to overwhelm it. The dog drank, its eyes flicking toward the door. Outside, the deer stood by the fence, its thin legs planted in the snow, watching the building where the dog lay. The rescue center smelled of antiseptic and damp fur, its air warmed by heaters that buzzed softly. The volunteers named the dog Nera, its black and brown coat dark against the white blanket. They set up a soft bed in the treatment room, where Nera lay under the heat lamp. Her breathing steadied, but her body remained weak, her legs too frail to stand. The volunteers checked her vitals, their hands moving carefully over her thin frame. Her pulse was stronger now, but her eyes stayed fixed on the door, restless and searching. The deer, still outside, pressed close to the fence, its hooves scraping the frozen ground. Its coat was dull, its ribs stark against its sides. The volunteers watched it through the window, its presence tugging at their thoughts. They decided to bring it inside, knowing the cold would claim it otherwise. One volunteer opened the gate, scattering grain to coax the deer forward. It stepped cautiously, its legs wobbling, into a small enclosure near Nera's room. They named it Birch, its pale coat like the bark of the trees in the valley. Nera's body relaxed when Birch was brought inside. Her head lowered onto the bed, her eyes softening for the first time. The volunteers watched, their movements slowing. Nera's focus shifted to the enclosure, where Birch stood, its nose twitching at the grain. The dog's breathing slowed, her tension easing, as if Birch's safety anchored her. The volunteers offered Nera a small amount of soft food, but she only nibbled, her attention fixed on Birch. When Birch ate, Nera's body seemed to settle further, her eyes steady on the deer. The bond between Nera and Birch was clear, forged in the harsh cold of the forest. The volunteers observed how Nera's strength seemed tied to Birch's presence. If Birch moved to the far side of the enclosure, Nera's head would lift, her eyes tracking him. If Birch refused food, Nera's body tensed, her own meal untouched. The volunteers worked quietly, cleaning Nera's scrapes and monitoring her condition. The room was warm, but the air carried a weight, a sense of something deeper than a routine rescue. Nera and Birch had survived together, their lives intertwined in a way that left the volunteers silent, their hands steady but their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what they had witnessed in the valley. The rescue center's treatment room glowed softly under the heat lamp, its warmth a stark contrast to the icy wind rattling the windows. Nera lay on her bed, her black and brown fur now dry but still clinging to her thin frame. Her breathing was steady, but her body remained weak, her legs trembling when she tried to shift. The volunteers moved quietly, their boots squeaking on the linoleum floor as they checked her bandages. Nera's eyes, dark and watchful, stayed fixed on the enclosure where Birch stood. The deer's hooves clicked against the concrete floor, its nose nudging the pile of grain scattered before it. Birch's condition was fragile, his body lean from weeks of scarcity. His pale coat hung loosely over his ribs, and his steps were cautious, as if each movement cost him effort. The volunteers offered him fresh water and more grain, watching as he ate slowly, his eyes flicking toward Nera's bed. Nera's head lifted slightly when Birch ate, her body easing as if his survival fueled her own. When Birch paused, his head drooping, Nera's eyes narrowed, and she refused her own food, a small bowl of soft meat left untouched beside her. The volunteers observed this pattern, their hands pausing over their tasks. Nera's strength seemed tethered to Birch's well-being. If Birch moved closer to her, her breathing deepened, her body settling into the bed. If Birch turned away, Nera's head would rise, her gaze sharp and unyielding. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the heater and the soft shuffle of Birch's hooves. The volunteers worked diligently, cleaning Nera's scrapes and monitoring her temperature. Her body was warming, but her hunger lingered, her frame a testament to the sacrifices she had made. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the valley in silence. The volunteers glanced at the windows, their faces tight with concern. Nera and Birch had endured the forest's cruelty together, their bond forged in desperation. The dog had risked her life under the ice, not for herself, but for the deer now standing a few feet away. The volunteers adjusted Nera's blanket, their movements careful, their thoughts heavy. The rescue had saved Nera's body, but her spirit was tied to Birch, her eyes never leaving him. The weight of their connection filled the room, a silent reminder of the cost of survival in a world so cold and unforgiving. The days passed slowly in the rescue center, the air thick with the scent of hay and antiseptic. Nera's bed was moved closer to Birch's enclosure, the volunteers noticing how her body calmed when he was near. Her fur began to regain its sheen, though her ribs still pressed sharply against her skin. She ate small amounts, but only after Birch took his grain, her eyes tracking his every move. The volunteers offered her more food, their hands gentle as they placed the bowl beside her. Nera's gaze would shift to Birch, and only when his head lowered to eat would she take a bite. Birch grew stronger, his steps less wobbly, his coat filling out slightly with each meal. His eyes, once dull with hunger, now held a faint spark. He paced the enclosure, his hooves tapping rhythmically, his nose often pressed toward Nera's bed. The volunteers watched this exchange, their movements slowing as they cleaned the enclosure or refilled Birch's water. Nera's strength seemed to mirror Birch's recovery, her body responding to his progress. When Birch stood tall, Nera's head rested comfortably. When Birch hesitated, Nera's body tensed, her eyes sharp with concern. The treatment room was a haven from the winter outside, where snow piled high against the walls. The volunteers worked tirelessly, their hands stained with antiseptic, their coats dusted with hay. They monitored Nera's weight, noting small improvements, but her frailty lingered. Her legs could not yet support her for long, and her breathing grew labored after any effort. Yet her focus on Birch never wavered. The volunteers saw how she watched him, her eyes steady even when her body trembled. Birch, in turn, seemed to sense her gaze, often pausing to face her, their connection a quiet force in the room. The volunteers' faces grew heavy as they worked. They had seen many animals pass through the center, but none like Nera and Birch. The dog's sacrifice in the frozen creek had been for the deer, a choice that left her body broken but her will unbroken. The volunteers adjusted Nera's bed, ensuring she could see Birch clearly. They scattered fresh grain for him, their hands moving with care. The bond between the two animals was a weight they all felt, a reminder of loyalty forged in the harshest conditions. The snow continued to fall outside, sealing the valley in silence, while inside, Nera and Birch held on to each other through their shared survival. The rescue center's treatment room was a small sanctuary, its walls echoing with the soft hum of heaters and the faint clatter of Birch's hooves. Nera's bed sat close to the enclosure, her black and brown fur now softer, though her body remained gaunt. Her eyes, ever watchful, followed Birch as he moved, his steps steadier each day. The volunteers noted small improvements in Nera's strength. Her legs held her weight for brief moments, and her breathing was less labored. Yet her focus stayed on Birch, her head lifting whenever he approached the edge of his enclosure, her body tensing when he turned away. Birch's coat gleamed faintly under the room's light, his frame filling out as he ate steadily. His eyes, brighter now, often met Nera's, and he would pause, his nose twitching toward her bed. The volunteers watched this silent exchange, their hands slowing as they swept the enclosure or refilled Birch's grain. Nera ate only when Birch did, her small bites mirroring his. If Birch hesitated, his head lowered over untouched food, Nera's bowl would remain full, her gaze fixed on him. The volunteers adjusted her diet, offering softer meats to tempt her, but her appetite depended on Birch's. The winter outside grew fiercer, the snow piling higher against the center's walls, sealing the valley in a deep freeze. Inside, the air was warm, but heavy with the weight of Nera's devotion. The volunteers moved carefully, their boots scuffing the floor, their faces etched with quiet concern. They cleaned Nera's bed, checked her bandages, and monitored her slow recovery. Her body was healing, but her spirit seemed tied to Birch's survival, her energy rising and falling with his. When Birch stood strong, Nera's eyes softened, her body resting easier. When Birch faltered, Nera's frame tensed, her breathing quickening. The volunteers had seen many animals, but none carried the bond Nera and Birch shared. The dog had faced the ice for the deer, her body broken to keep him alive. Now, in the warmth of the center, that sacrifice lingered in her watchful gaze. The volunteers scattered fresh grain for Birch, their hands steady but their hearts heavy. They adjusted Nera's blanket, ensuring she could see him clearly. The room was quiet, save for the soft sounds of eating and the wind's low moan outside. Nera and Birch remained bound, their lives intertwined in a way that filled the space with an unspoken sorrow, a testament to their shared struggle in the frozen forest. The days stretched on, the rescue center a haven against the relentless winter. Nera's strength grew slowly, her legs now able to support her for short walks across the treatment room. Her fur, once matted and dull, shone softly under the heat lamp. Yet her eyes never strayed from Birch, who paced his enclosure with newfound confidence. His coat was fuller, his ribs less stark, and his steps carried a quiet strength. He often stopped to face Nera, his head tilted toward her bed, as if acknowledging her presence. The volunteers watched, their movements deliberate as they cleaned or brought fresh water, their thoughts heavy with the bond they witnessed. Nera's recovery was fragile, her body still marked by the toll of the ice. She ate more steadily now, but only after Birch took his grain, her eyes tracking his every bite. If Birch paused, his nose hovering over the food, Nera's head would lift, her own meal untouched until he resumed. The volunteers adjusted her bed daily, keeping it close to Birch's enclosure. Her breathing steadied when he was near, her body relaxing in a way it never did when he was out of sight. Birch, too, seemed to draw strength from Nera, his eyes brightening when she stood, however briefly. The snow outside buried the valley deeper, the wind howling through the bare trees. Inside, the center's warmth wrapped Nera and Birch in a fragile safety. The volunteers worked tirelessly, their hands rough from handling hay and medical supplies. They monitored Nera's weight, noting her slow gains, but her frailty lingered, her body a reminder of her sacrifice. Her eyes, though brighter, carried a quiet intensity, always fixed on Birch. The deer, in turn, would pause his pacing to stand near her, his breath visible in the cool air of the enclosure. The volunteers' faces grew heavier each day. They had saved many animals, but Nera and Birch were different. The dog's plunge beneath the ice had been for the deer, a choice that left her weak but unwavering. Now, her recovery seemed tied to his survival, her strength ebbing and flowing with his. The volunteers swept the enclosure, their brooms scraping softly, and refilled Birch's water with care. The room held a quiet sorrow, the bond between Nera and Birch a weight that pressed on everyone. The winter's cold seeped through the walls, but inside, the dog and deer clung to each other, their connection a fragile thread holding them against the harshness of the world outside. The rescue center's treatment room was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of hay and the faint hum of heaters. Nera's bed, now worn from constant adjustments, sat close to Birch's enclosure. Her black and brown fur gleamed softly, her body stronger but still thin, her ribs faintly visible. She could stand longer now, her legs steadier, as she shuffled toward the enclosure's edge. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, followed Birch's every movement. The deer, his coat now thick and pale, moved with confidence, his hooves tapping lightly on the concrete. His ribs were less pronounced, his strength a testament to the care he received. Birch often paused to face Nera, his head lowered as if meeting her gaze. The volunteers watched, their hands slowing as they swept the enclosure or refilled his grain. Nera ate more consistently, but her appetite remained tied to Birch's. If he ate steadily, her bowl would empty slowly. If he hesitated, her head would lift, her food untouched until he resumed. The volunteers adjusted her diet, offering richer meals to build her strength, but her focus stayed on Birch, her body relaxing only when he was near. The winter outside raged on, the snow piling against the center's walls, the wind a constant moan through the valley. Inside, the warmth held firm, but the room carried a growing weight. Nera's recovery had plateaued. Her body, though stronger, bore the scars of her time under the ice. Her breathing grew labored after short walks, and her eyes, though bright, carried a quiet strain. The volunteers monitored her closely, their hands gentle as they checked her pulse, their faces tight with concern. Birch, now robust, paced his enclosure with ease, but his eyes often sought Nera, as if sensing her fragility. The volunteers moved with care, their boots soft on the floor, their thoughts heavy. Nera's sacrifice in the frozen creek had saved Birch, but it had taken a toll she could not fully overcome. Her devotion to him remained, her gaze fixed on his every step. The volunteers scattered fresh grain for Birch, their hands steady but slow. They adjusted Nera's blanket, ensuring she could see him clearly. The bond between the dog and deer filled the room, a silent force that spoke of loyalty and loss. The winter's cold pressed against the windows, but inside, Nera and Birch held onto each other, their connection a fragile light in the face of the valley's unrelenting frost. The morning was still, the rescue center bathed in the pale light filtering through frost-covered windows. Nera lay on her bed, her black and brown fur soft, but her body still. The volunteers entered quietly, their boots barely disturbing the silence. They approached Nera, their hands reaching to check her, but her chest did not rise. Her eyes, once fixed on Birch, were closed. Birch stood in his enclosure, his hooves unmoving, his head lowered toward her bed. The volunteers' hands froze, their breath catching. Nera was gone, her body finally giving out after weeks of fighting to stay with Birch. The room felt heavier, the air thick with loss. The volunteers stood motionless, their faces pale, their hands empty. Birch did not move, his eyes locked on Nera's still form. The bond that had sustained them through the frozen forest had ended, but its weight lingered. The volunteers left Birch beside Nera, allowing him to stay with her. He stood there for hours, his breath visible in the cool air, his body rigid. Eventually, he turned away, his steps slow, his head low as he moved to the far side of the enclosure. The volunteers prepared Birch for release, his strength now sufficient for the wild. They opened the enclosure gate, guiding him to a truck that would carry him to the forest's edge. His coat gleamed in the weak sunlight, his body strong but his movements hesitant. The valley, still blanketed in snow, stretched out before him. The volunteers released him near the creek where Nera had been found, its surface now a solid sheet of ice. Birch stepped into the forest, his hooves crunching softly, his form disappearing among the trees. The volunteers watched until he was gone, their faces tight with sorrow. Nera's sacrifice had given Birch a chance to live, her life spent to ensure his survival. The volunteers returned to the center, the empty bed a stark reminder of her absence. The room, once filled with the quiet rhythm of Nera and Birch's bond, was silent now, the heaters hummed the only sound. The winter outside held the valley in its grip, but Nera's devotion had left a mark deeper than the cold. Her choice to risk everything for Birch spoke of a love that transcended her own survival, a truth that lingered in the volunteers' heavy hearts. The forest stood quiet, and though Birch was free, the cost of his life was Nera's, a loss that echoed in the stillness of the frozen valley.